For those of you who are not biologists, I want to very briefly explain to you why Bob Trivers is here tonight and why we are so excited to have him here. Because among today's students of animal behavior and evolutionary biology, there is hardly another name that is more widely known. And Bob has earned this popularity with 5 ideas that have been of the greatest importance for the development of the discipline of sociobiology, which is the evolutionary study of behavior. His ideas have inspired many behavioral ecologists, and I think in retrospect, to the extent that this is possible today, most of their work has confirmed his main ideas. The first problem he focused on was how evolutionary theory could explain cooperation between individuals that are not related. And he came up with the idea of reciprocal altruism to solve this problem. His second insight deals with the way in which the traits of male and female animals are influenced by their investment in their offspring, hence the theory of parental care. A third hypothesis presented by him is the explanation of why certain species sometimes give birth to more young of the same sex. And so he gave birth to sex ratio theory, which has been a prominent body of theory in our field. He also, building upon his insights in parental care, explained why conflicts often arise between older young and their parents, so-called parent-offspring conflict, something most of us in reproductive age are also intimately familiar with. And finally, he predicted that the workers in an ant community, which are always female, may be expected to invest 3 times the amount of resources in bringing up their sisters than their brothers. And this is another facet of the sex ratio adjustment theory. More recently, Bob has been very productive and prolific, and his work has resulted in an enormously important and interesting book dealing with the biology of selfish genetic elements, and I think he spent about 10 years writing on this one. And currently, that's also the reason why he is in Berlin, is working on a book on deceit and self-deception. I should also mention, I know that Bob is a shy and modest person, as you will see in a moment, but he is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He also won the Distinguished Animal Behaviorist Award of the Animal Behavior Society. And last but certainly not least, in 2007, he was awarded the Crawford Prize for Biological Sciences by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for his fundamental analysis of social evolution, conflict, and cooperation. And again, as the biologists among you know, the Crawford Prize is widely recognized as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for biologists. And with his tremendous experience and creativity, Bob Trivers is the first person that came to mind when I thought about whom to invite to talk about Charles Darwin and his birthday today. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Bob here, and I look forward to your thoughts entitled Remembering Charles Darwin. Bob.
He gave us our system of logic, the system of logic for all of biology. He spent his life developing its every application. We benefit from celebrating him and his life, and perhaps we also benefit from identifying with a great organism. He was born 200 years ago today, along with another great human being, Abraham Lincoln, a coincidence out of which I will make nothing. I will take first his work, which was really his life, and then talk about his life. For his work, I'll start out, of course, with evolution by natural selection, and then the problems that he thought were most serious about it and how he went about dealing with these problems. Then I'll discuss briefly his emphasis on behavior throughout his work and why behavior is so central to evolutionary theory and why we who study animal behavior should bear this connection, I think, always in mind. And then, as I say, I will turn to the details of his life, and then we will, with the help of this orchestra, sing Happy Birthday. I believe in English. And I will render it first, briefly, and then we will all do it together, if that's all right. So, the system of logic he gave us, of course, is evolution through natural selection. And this meant biological change over time, eventually so systematic that it extends 3 billion years backwards in time and to organisms smaller and less sophisticated than bacteria. By natural selection, we refer to the mechanism by which evolutionary change took place, and that was simply differential reproductive success, where reproductive success is the number of offspring that you produce. So some individuals leave many surviving offspring, and others few or none. Could I have that? Thanks. And the traits of those that leave many surviving offspring become more numerous over time. So in this view, what are organisms trying to do after 3 billion years of natural selection? They're trying to maximize their reproductive success. There's only been one change, one slight change in our understanding of natural selection. It's a natural extension of his argument, and he would have pointed it out himself if he understood genetics, which he did not. And that extension was simply to say, well, we're not only related to our children, we are equally related to our full siblings, brothers and sisters through both parents, and therefore, from the standpoint of natural selection, es ist ganz egal whether you have one more child or add one more brother or sister to the world. So reproductive success was expanded to include not just children, but also effects on other relatives, where these effects are devalued by your degree of relatedness to that relative. Degree of relatedness being the chance for any given gene in you that a copy is found in that relative. Now, a number of people prior to Darwin had posited the notion of evolution, but none of them really organized evidence very systematically to support it. And that Darwin did thoroughly. Every aspect of biology that he knew, comparative anatomy, embryology, paleontology, any and all of these, he would organize the evidence such that at the end of it you would say evolution had to have taken place. Let me give you just one small example. Zoogeography. The distribution of animals and plants in nature. He pointed out that oceanic islands, sitting way out there, far distant from other land, by his theory, they had to have been colonized from some near mainland, or some quite distant mainland. They could not have just been dropped down by God when the world was created. If they were colonized, then certain things would be true. For example, small mammals can colonize distant islands by riding on tree trunks much more easily or flying than large mammals. So it should not surprise us that the mammalian fauna on small oceanic islands consists of rats and bats, slightly overstating the matter. Likewise, frogs with their wet skin, typically, wet outer skin, are very vulnerable to seawater, drying up during a long voyage. So you do not tend to have frogs that live in ponds or little lakes on oceanic islands. Instead, if you have any, they're tree frogs, which live in trees and already have a dry skin. You find many, many lizards, not many frogs. He did experiments. He would have down in his basement huge vats of seawater, and he'd toss in the seeds of various plants that he knew had colonized some distant island, by his theory, and he would compute how fast the ocean currents were going, and he'd haul the seed out after 80 days and plant it. And he proved thereby that indeed plants could be colonizing these distant areas. So this was the work he did on evolution, establishing it beyond a reasonable doubt, and at the same time supplying a mechanism. Now, evolution was accepted widely before too long. When I say widely, that does not include the United States of America, you understand, where still less than half of people claim to, quote, believe in evolution, like I believe, or I don't believe. Only Turkey, of the nations that have been canvassed, shows less of a lust for Darwin's thinking than the United States. But elsewhere, and certainly in advanced countries like Scandinavian countries, 80% are convinced by now that evolution has taken place. All right. Now, some people who, and this is often people that don't have such a good idea, they're not very interested in the problems associated with the idea. They run from them or hide them. But Darwin was exactly the other way around. Indeed, he kept a special notebook where objections to his theory were kept so that he would be sure to deal with them. And I want to mention 4. And he describes his reaction to them in physical terms. The eye made him shudder when he just looked at the eye. It just contradicted his theory on the spot, as I'll come back to. The sterile ants, that is, ants that were not reproducing, like most of the ants that you step on. Most of the ants without wings do not reproduce, yet they're adult and they evolve. Now, how on earth is that happening? They're not leaving any surviving offspring. So how are their genes changing? What's going on here? There was a description in the late 18th century of orchids, flower, that did not have any nectar, and yet they were pollinated by insects. Now, this bothered him a lot because he said, if you could ever show me that an animal or a plant was doing something for some other species' benefit and not their own, it would annihilate his theory on the spot. So here you've got insects pollinating orchids, and yet they're not getting a reward. So his reaction to that was to disbelieve it. But he didn't leave it at disbelief. He then studied the matter. And finally, the peacock's tail made him sick, he said, whenever he saw that, because he had this notion of natural selection as always improving your ability to survive, because it was survival that led to reproduction. And the same traits that were good for survival were also good for, let us say, producing many children if you are female. But why these peacock's tail? That would seem to get in the way of survival. So it made him sick. Now let me take up each of these in just a little bit more detail. The eye is a very, if not a perfect, at least a very complex and beautiful camera. And how are you going to get that through small changes taking place, building up over long periods of time? Because part of his notion of evolution by natural selection, not just natural selection, and that it led to change over time, but it was gradual change. And this was important to him. There were not big jumps where suddenly a new form appeared and spread. He knew that heredity produced gradual changes, and these were the ones that selection had to act on. So what he did was to organize all the evidence on the comparative anatomy of eyes, from eyes that just consisted of a couple of light-sensitive cells on the surface, to eyes that had the light-sensitive cells, but now they were in a concave surface where the light was gathered slightly better, to eyes that had a primitive focusing device, etc., etc., etc. In other words, he convinced himself and others that you could see gradations, not, of course, every single one, but enough to make it plausible that this complicated organ could have evolved from very simple beginnings. Now, pollination without reward, as he said, his theory was fatal if any trait evolved for the exclusive good of another species. He ended up writing an entire book on it, on the various contrivances by which orchids are fertilized by insects. And it turns out, we know now there are about 18,500 species of orchids. They're a very speciose group, family of plants. And 5% are pollinated by sexual deception. That is, the insect is fooled into thinking the orchid is a female of his species. The orchid more or less looks like a female of his species, but it delivers a smell that is very close to the smell of the female of the pollinating species. Incidentally, it plays a cruel game on the male, as happens in other systems of sexual deception. They arouse the male, but they don't give him a climax, because they don't want him to. They don't want the male landing on an orchid and saying, "Oh, what a lovely female," and going all the way, and then he says, "All right, let me have a good beer and a good night's sleep, and then we'll try it again." They want him going from flower to flower to flower. So he's got, so to speak, a permanent erection and no satisfaction. All right. Incidentally, it's little known that a third of orchids are pollinated by food deception. That is, they mimic food that the pollinator would like to eat. And of course, there's no food there. And as is typically the case, if you compare the behavior of those that are getting an actual reward versus those that are getting a pseudo-reward, the species where they get a pseudo-reward, the male spends very little time. He's sexually excited and he almost wants to, but nah, this ain't the real thing, and he's on somewhere else. Okay, so that's how he solved that problem. Now, the problem of sterile ants initially looks a little bit that way, but that wasn't quite what bothered Darwin. In other words, there you have a female ant not reproducing herself but working for someone else. But most of the time she's working for her mother. And the genetic problem bothered him a bit more. How did genetic change take place such that the workers could evolve all these different traits after they went sterile? As I say, he did not know genetics, so he just said selection acts at the family level. And we know that's just an approximation, but it was good enough for the situation at hand. Incidentally, his own theory of genetics had to do with gemmules, which were sent by all of the organs down to the gonads and then transmitted during sex. Now, Peter was kind enough not to mention that I threw away 15 years of my life with another man writing a book on all cases of internal genetic conflict where the genes in you are fighting. But imagine that the genetic system was the way Darwin imagined. the closer you got to the gonads, the more fighting there would be between these gemmules to get into the gonads. It would be painful. Now, let me act out the male first, if you forgive me. You come up to a female, you think you want to have sex, there's excruciating pain down here, and the closer you get to the sexual act, the worse it is. All right, let me be a female. So now it's the ovaries back here, and, you know, in principle she'd like to have sex, but she's got this pain in her back. Anyway, that's a side comment on his genetic theory, which did not pan out. Now, let's turn to the peacock's tail. So I've already mentioned what the problem with a peacock's tail there was. How could you explain it in terms of survival? And he realized, it's not that, it's what he then called sexual selection, which most of us now would just put underneath natural selection as an example of natural selection, a subcategory. But for him, it was competition within one sex for access to members of the opposite sex, and it was intersexual choice. And what that boiled down to was male-male competition and female choice. And he was sure via comparative evidence that female powers of discrimination, female choice, had to be a strong force in nature. That was, yes, baby. That was not a popular view at the time. Indeed, it was believed in Victorian England that it was the male that had the advanced aesthetic sense. You know, wasn't Rembrandt a male? I don't know how the argument ran. But Darwin knew from comparative study of birds, for example, that females had to be the discriminating ones. He almost solved the entire problem and would have wiped out one of my papers, because he also knew that males typically did not do much investment, if any, in the offspring. They just supplied the sperm. All the work was done by the female. But he didn't put the two sets of facts together. They're in his book, Sexual Selection, The Descent of Man, but he didn't quite reach there. Later on, when the geneticists rediscovered Mendel and were feeling their oats right around the turn of the 20th century, they ridiculed two aspects of Darwin that I've just mentioned, female choice and mimicry. They said, if you'll just remove these absurdities from the theory, we'll pay attention to the theory. But they weren't absurdities. Now, the Sexual Selection and Descent of Man is a big fat book, and I read it once upon a time, and I was not about to read it again for this talk. So I decided I'll just read it like some people read the Bible. You know, you just flip it open to a page, and you look down, and whatever your eye hits, that's what God or Charles wants you to know that day. So here we are. And literally, I didn't have to flip it a second time. I flipped it once, and my eye went to this, something I had completely forgotten. Various facts which I have, I'm quoting him now, various facts which I have elsewhere given prove that the color of the skin and hair is sometimes correlated in a surprising manner with a complete immunity from the action of certain vegetable poisons and from the attacks of certain parasites. He's saying dark skin tends to protect you from parasites. Hence it occurred to me that Negroes and other dark races might have acquired their dark tints by the darker individuals escaping during a long series of generations from the deadly influence of the miasmas, the diseases, of their native countries. I said, aber was ist das? Because for 40 years I have paid attention to the literature on skin color, out of a general interest and perhaps out of a personal interest as well. And for 30, whatever it was, 5 of those years, having forgotten Darwin, if I ever read that sentence, I followed the usual view that dark skin protects you from the sun, which it does. Darker skinned people have less malignant melanoma. and that in turn, very light skin is helpful to manufacture vitamin D up in really northern climates where you don't get much sunlight and may not have another source of vitamin D. And then Anders Muller, the brilliant Danish ornithologist, in 2003 said, no, that cannot be the only explanation. Here's a paper. And it was all about the biochemistry of melanocytes and how the biochemistry of producing melanin, more than melanin itself, if I understood it, protects against bacteria, fungi, etc., etc. This helps explain something that could not be explained by the other view. Namely, there are very dark-skinned African peoples who are not out in the sun at all. They are deep in the forest. And you have people on the, let's say in West Africa, you have people in East Africa who are much more exposed to the sun, in Kenya and so on. They're 4,000 feet up, etc. And yet their skin is not so dark. But parasites are a strong factor in the tropical forest. They're a weaker factor at 4,000 feet. They're non-existent as a factor in Norway. Slight exaggeration. Okay? So Darwin already knew something that has been forgotten then for 110 years, and now we're rediscovering it out of biochemistry. All right. We don't want to spend all day here, do we? So let me just say a few comments on behavior, and then let's talk about his life. So, and you know, we're animal behaviorists, except those of us who are just good old residents of Göttingen. He emphasized behavior. He wrote 4 different books on plant behavior, or where behavior was an important part of it. Deceiving insect plants, I've just told you about, the orchid book. He wrote a book on the use of insects to further outbreeding among plants. He wrote a book on carnivorous plants that are waiting there to grab an insect and eat it. And he wrote a book on climbing plants. And I've watched one in Jamaica in my home, and it'll send up a tendril, and the thing is very poorly anchored, and it just kind of wanders around in the wind and whatnot. But let it hit something, and ooh, it winds itself around it and starts growing up from there. For behavior, of course, he wrote a famous book on expression of the emotions in animals and humans, and his last book was on earthworms. And I only have one quote from that, and that is that their sexual desires are so strong that they can overcome their dread of daylight, i.e. they'll come above ground for sex. It's kind of like ourselves, only the other way around. Overcome our dread of darkness. Anyway, where was I? Why behavior? I think the point about behavior is that behavior is your first and easiest guide as to what's important in another organism's life. If it's an animal and the animal goes and does something, it tells you that's important to the animal. And so if you're interested in functional reasoning, what is the function of the biological trait? What function, purpose does it serve in the organism's life? Behavior is a natural guide into functional thinking. Behavior is a natural guide into a deeper understanding of theory. Kinship theory, which broadened our concept of natural selection, came out of behavior. Our understanding of sexual selection did, and so on. So I think as animal behaviorists, or even plant behaviorists, we should always keep that in mind. There's a natural link between evolutionary theory and behavior, and we benefit from being conscious of it. All right, let's just handle the rest of his life and try to do this briskly here. So, okay, let's just run through a bunch of facts. He was upper middle class family of doctors and whatnot. He never had to worry about money his entire life. That's a great blessing for a scientist. I've only been able to experience the blessing since the sainted Swedish people, decided to advance some real guilt in my direction. Otherwise, you can waste a lot of time. On the other hand, he always had he always had an allowance such that his father worried that it might make him a ne'er-do-well, and he wrote him once and said, if you keep this up, just going around and shooting birds and hanging out in clubs, you'll disgrace not only yourself but your family. And something in me tells me the father was more concerned about the disgrace to the family. When Darwin left on the voyage of Beagle, he wrote his father saying he would have to be, quote, deuced clever. That's very clever in English land. Deuced clever to spend his allowance. His father dryly replied, I hear you are indeed very clever. In other words, Dad's expecting his money to disappear even when he's on a ship far from land. He was known to have strong moral principles. He was utterly opposed to slavery, as were his grandfathers and his parents and so on. To give you one quote, near Rio de Janeiro, I lived opposite to an old lady who kept screws to crush the fingers of her female slaves. I have stayed in a house where a young household mulatto daily and hourly was reviled, beaten, and persecuted enough to break the spirit of the lowest animal. It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble, to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty. When he was on the voyage of the Beagle, he had a famous exchange with the captain of the Beagle, Fitzroy, who liked slavery and praised it, and they got into a little argument, and Fitzroy said that he had just visited this big plantation with this wealthy slave owner, had a lot of slaves, and he brought a lot of slaves out in front of him, and he asked each of them if they were unhappy with being a slave, and every one of them said no. And Darwin asked Fitzroy what the opinion of a slave was worth in the presence of his or her master. Fitzroy flew into a rage and said he could no longer eat with him. Well, Darwin's role was to eat with him. That's what he was assigned to do. He was sharing Fitzroy's cabin, and it was to provide dinner conversation was the justification for him being along. So he thought he was going to be left off at the next port. But fortunately, other people intervened. Fitzroy apologized. They went back to eating together. Fine. Now, he did something very interesting, which I, having been married twice and looking around for number 3, have often thought I should have done and didn't do. He made a list 6 years before he married his wife on the pros and cons of marriage. So here they are. On the positive side, children, if it please God. Constant companion and friend in old age who will feel interested in you. I like that one. Older I get, the more I like that one. Home and someone to take care of house, fine. Charms of music and female chit-chat. Well, that sounds a little bit dated, you know, but upper-class Englishmen in the 19th century, what can I say? Good for one's health. No doubt about that. Among other things, it lowers your testosterone level. The lowest levels out there, or in here, are married men who are not playing around. For you married men who are also playing around, your testosterone level's higher. And if you're out there where I am, well, I don't know that I have a testosterone level yet left, but if I did, it would be the highest, you know, because you're out there. All right. Then the final one, which we hope his wife never saw, object to be beloved and played with better than a dog anyhow. So I'm assuming Emma never saw this list, and a friend of mine I read it to said, the only question is why didn't he burn the list after he wrote it, you know? All right, what are his reasons not to marry? Terrible loss of time. Less money for books. Less freedom to go where one likes. Less conversation of clever men at clubs. That's the other half of the female chit-chat. Do you want the female chit-chat, or do you want the clever men at clubs? Expense and anxiety of children. So there's an upside to children? Of course. Ain't that what life's all about? But parental investment, as anybody who's tried it, ain't easy. And he mentions forced to visit relatives and bend in every trifle. And then he mentions fatness and idleness as being a result of marriage. His summary vision is as follows. Nice, soft wife. That's as near as he gets to sex, as far as I can tell. Nice, soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books and music. Let's go for it. All right. Now, I used to criticize myself and say, what's wrong with you? You will spend 2 days trying to think through a trivial sex ratio problem in WASPs. You'll graph it, you'll write a summary, you'll take notes. But if you have an important decision to make in your life, get married, have a child, deal with this child, do you ever bother to write it down? Do you ever think it through and then rethink it through? Hell no, you just turn yourself on autopilot and head off. Now, however, there's a recent paper I just draw your attention to that suggests, at least in the short term, you make certain decisions better if you don't think about them. But this is real short term. This is 5 minutes versus making the decision right away or thinking about it for 5 minutes. And then the experimental situation is they tell you about the problem, but then they distract your attention for 5 minutes. So you do something called unconscious thinking. And it has certain benefits over conscious thinking. It's able to keep more information at hand to compare. However, this is over a very short time period, so I'm not sure it's at all relevant to a major problem like get married or not. Okay, let's finish off with his life, and we can sing and move on. He was ambitious, as he mentions, and I'm quoting now from his autobiography. He got a letter that was sent to him while he was on the voyage of the Beagle saying they really liked his paleontological specimens. After reading this letter, I clambered over the mountains of Ascension with a bounding step and made the volcanic rocks resound under my geological hammer. All this shows how ambitious I was, but I think that I can say with truth that in after years, though I cared in the highest degree for the opinion of such men as Lyell and Hooker, who were my friends, I did not care much about the general public. I do not mean to say that a favorable review or a large sale of my books did not please me greatly, but the pleasure was a fleeting one, and I'm sure that I have never turned 1 inch out of my course to gain fame. Well, he knew he was gaining lasting fame, so it's kind of an easy choice for him. But still, it reminds me of a story about Stephen Jay Gould. I hope none of you know him or know who I'm talking about. And it involves Ernst Mayr, the famous German-born biologist. And Stephen Jay was about to die of cancer. And he ran into a good friend of mine, a famous primatologist at Harvard. And he said to him, Gott sei Dank, dass Ernst so lang Leben hast und hat gelebt, mein Buch zu sehen, because he had just finished The Foundations of Biological Thought, or some such pile of kvach, and it's a fat book. Someone gave it to me once, and I use it for these kind of exercises. Don't read it. There's nothing in it worth. So he says this. So then the same primatologist runs into Ernst Mayr. After all, Stephen Jay is delighted that Ernst has been alive to see the book. And Ernst says to him, I'm afraid there are 2 kinds of scientists. Those that care about the truth and those that care about their public image. I'm afraid Steve is one of the latter kind. All right. I didn't have to go out of my way to kick Stephen Jay Gould, but I did. That's my weakness. But Darwin did not do things for cheap ambition. Okay. Finally, I guess it's finally, he was sick his entire adult life. Nausea and vomiting, ever since he came back from the voyage of the Beagle. Now, some have said this was due to the psychological stress of breaking such an enormous taboo, religion, we came from Affen und so weiter, and that this psychological stress caused enough internal Sturm und Drang that he was sick all the time. Fine, that's one theory. Another theory was that he had Chagas's disease, which I didn't have the time to look up, but I remember it's transmitted by a bug they call the kissing bug because it likes to bite you on your membranes, like your lips, and Darwin was assiduously describing this bug biting his lip, as part of his journal. So that might have been the reason. But I like it also because it relates to his last words. These are his last words known. And they show to me what a loving father he was. He was vomiting and had his usual nausea just before he died. And one of his daughters, as is often the case, he had 10 children, of whom I think 7 survived into adulthood. One daughter kind of adopted him as, her role was to look after Dad. So she's right there while he's vomiting, and she says, "Oh, that terrible nausea still." And Darwin says, "It is not terrible, but it is nausea," and then fell over. So the point is, he first corrects his daughter on what would bother her heart. It is not terrible. But good scientist that he is, yes, but it is nausea. So, let's see now. I will summarize, and then we will get a chance to sing, and then we will have our Freiheit. So, in summary, he laid the foundation for all of biology. He developed the implications of this foundation in many fruitful directions. He was very critical of his own theory and with a special eye towards objections which, if verified, might disprove the theory entirely. He did not deviate from his serious purpose for reasons of cheap fame or whatnot. He concentrated on behavior, plants, animals, and humans, as I think because they were the best guide to function, which was what evolutionary logic gave him. Throughout, he was a humane, loving person, father, friend, and teacher. He had a great vision, and with that, I will end the talk today, and this is the famous last line of The Origin of Species. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I love it. Especially this have been and are being evolved. Also lassen wir jetzt Happy Birthday singen und ungefähr so, und dann werden wir anfangen, so kind of like Happy Birthday, dear Charlie. Happy birthday, dear Charlie. Happy birthday, Charles Darwin. Happy birthday, dear Charlie. Also. This day, dear